The second problem is that the components of national security are not managed as a system. We do not look at that whole system and figure out how it's going to be managed. And so there are lots of sort of strategic system management tasks that are not performed at all. A key one is strategic guidance from the president. You know, most of the strategy documents that are out there are public relations documents. They're goal-oriented. They're not really strategy documents. There's nobody in the government who picks up the strategy documents and says, aha, now I understand what I ought to be doing. And there is no real strategic guidance. And so we don't have unity of purpose across the government. And for the most part, departments and agencies formulate their own guidance, and they do as they see from their perspective, all well-intentioned, but it's not from the national perspective. But there are lots of other things we don't do in terms of strategic systems management. We don't do those macro resource trade-offs. We're not looking at what missions we're trying to accomplish, how we ought to balance across all of the instruments of power. Another thing that we don't do is we don't do assessments from a system-wide perspective. All of the assessments of how we're doing are done in the departmental stovepipes. We don't manage human capital from an interagency or national security perspective. Lots of things that are not done. So this needs to change. The fact that the system has these major inabilities often forces the White House to centralize issue management. But the White House then can become a bottleneck. It can only really handle 2 or 3 issues, and even then it has lots of problems doing it, when in fact in the whole national security system there may be dozens and dozens of issues that really need to be handled from a national perspective. So we end up overburdening the White House and the National Security Council system. Our resources are not aligned with strategic objectives. You know, the president's budget is sort of put together on an input basis, not on an output basis. You know, we don't have those missions stated. We don't have strategic objectives. We don't have yardsticks to measure how the departments and agencies are spending their money. And that's why we've ended up with this huge imbalance of all of the money going to the Pentagon, and the civilian departments and agencies are starved for resources. Then the last problem is the Congress, and as I'd mentioned, it's focused on the parts, but it cannot do whole of government, and it also reinforces divisions in the executive branch. When I was Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, I served on the Counterterrorism Security Group, and we actually had a fairly good group at the NSC, but we needed to integrate our programs. And when we sent our budgets up to Capitol Hill, you know, that's when they were pulled apart by the Congress. We were kind of punished for our efforts to collaborate. And I sort of have the view that if somebody in the executive branch actually does try to collaborate with another department and agency, they're certain to be punished when they get to Capitol Hill. Then some other problems to mention to you. We have no effective means of delegating the president's authority. I mentioned currently that entire responsibility for integration is on the president's shoulders. We've tried 2 things. One is the lead agency approach, and it has consistently failed because no self-respecting department is going to follow another department, especially when there are interests of the department involved. And the second approach that we tried is czars. Normally czars are even less successful because they don't have a departmental bureaucracy to help them, and they have no standing on the Hill, and they're fighting all of those departments and agencies. So we don't have effective means for delegating the president's authority. We don't have means for effective multi-agency execution. Everything is done ad hoc. The Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad, an ad hoc approach. Essentially, we can only execute either by creating something ad hoc or going back down through the departments and agencies. We don't do visioning or strategic planning at the national level. And part of this problem is because the system is so dysfunctional, it takes all of the energy of people just to handle the issues of today and tomorrow. Many of you work in government or have worked in government, have been trying to push these issues. When I was ASD Solic, my office worked incredibly hard to move things forward an inch. We were putting incredible human capital into this dysfunctional system. And we've done as well as we have because we have people, national security professionals, who are incredibly dedicated. If we did not have that, we would have, we'd be in a much worse situation than we are today. But we cannot rise out of that inbox of going from crisis to crisis or near-term issue to near-term issue because the system is so dysfunctional. We have to work it that hard, and to get out there and do the longer range kinds of things, there's really no capacity to do so. We don't have an interagency culture. We're dominated by the department and agency cultures. There's a lack of trust between the departments and agencies, which creates an enormous amount of friction. Often people talk about this in terms of a tax. And you know, the tax on our system is incredibly high because we don't trust each other. We're reluctant to share information. We don't do integrated planning because many departments and agencies don't plan at all. And so thinking about how we're going to do integrated planning becomes a real challenge. At the regional level, the only thing we have are the combatant commands. And they're working hard to figure out how do I get the other interagency players involved. But we need a much more formal mechanism for doing that. We are a government of specialists, not a government of leaders. If you look at our promotion criteria, they're really oriented on technical expertise. And during the Cold War, we could survive, muddle through with civilian non-leaders in leadership positions. But that era is past. We have got to have people with incredible leadership skills. We have no interagency human capital plan. We need sort of a Title IV like we have in Goldwater Nichols to think about what do we need in the interagency system, how will we incentivize people to serve there, how do we want to reward them, how do they need to be trained and educated. And then related back to this issue of trust, we have incredibly poor information sharing. The government knows a tremendous amount. It just can't get it to the point of application. And this is really a cultural issue. Going back to a lack of trust, not certain how somebody else will make use of our information. Okay, in our project we have 38 recommendations, and we've broken these into 7 themes. And I can't talk to you about all 38 recommendations. I would love to do so, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the important ones and highlight the themes. The first theme is this idea we need to adopt new approaches that are focused on national missions and outcomes. Forget about departmental missions and outcomes. No longer sufficient. What is it that the nation needs? Because when we focus on what the department needs, we may have a mini victory, but what the nation needs gets lost in that. And to focus on national missions and outcomes, we have to emphasize integrated effort, collaboration, and agility. In that regard, we have traditionally allowed our cabinet secretaries to be highly competitive. The moment they get confirmed, they put up their dukes and they're ready to take on every other cabinet secretary. My professional career, I've watched the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense spend most of their time sparring with each other. That world is over. Today's world is a world of collaboration, and we need people with great skills of collaboration. And I was delighted when the